Uh, the final movement we're going to talk about here in this particular section is the women's movement. Women are the world's largest minority. Of course, they're not a minority; they're a majority. But in terms of power and income and things like that, they are essentially a minority. The women's movement had tapered off significantly after women gained the right to vote during the Progressive Era. But in 1963, a woman named Betty Friedan will publish a book called The Feminine Mystique. And this will, we see this as the beginning of a new women's liberation movement. What she did was she had graduated from Smith College in 1947, and she went around and she interviewed the women that she had graduated with. And what she found was that while these women were college educated, most were wealthy suburban housewives, and most of them were frustrated and unhappy with their lives. They feel that their talents and their education was wasted, and they weren't being fulfilled like their husbands. And this became a great conversation in the country. Why do women have to stay home, even bright, capable women, while men go on to the workforce? JFK had a committee on the status of women to address discrimination against women. And in 1963, we get the Equal Pay Act, which gives women some ability, although it's fairly limited, to sue if they're being paid less than essentially a man doing the same job with the same experience and so forth. Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act will also establish some protection for women as a group that deserves civil rights. In 1966, Friedan creates the organization, the National Organization for Women, or NOW. And NOW will denounce traditional marriage, not marriage, but the idea that the woman should stay at home and take care of the house and the kids, and denounce the whole cult of domesticity around women. And they demanded equality at work. If a woman wanted to go out to the workplace, she should have that right, NOW would argue. Here's a really powerful quote from The Feminine Mystique in 1963. You should totally check this out. By the late 1960s, younger women had turned more liberal, and we developed this term, feminist. This came out of the New Left, the civil rights, and the anti-war movements. Often this would be associated with hippies and this sort of thing, although not always. But even within civil rights movements, women had faced discrimination. So a woman might show up to volunteer to help with the African American Civil Rights Crusade, and she would be told, well, why don't you go in there and make the coffee and make sure everybody has something to eat? And so a lot of these women were like, wait a minute, we're here fighting for these people's civil rights, but we're being treated kind of like second-class citizens. We're not being recognized for what we're truly capable of. Some more radical feminists rejected marriage, family structures, and even heterosexuality altogether, but that was really the radical fringe. Across America, many women began to see themselves as a besieged or oppressed group, much like the African Americans or Native Americans or Hispanics. We began to see feminist bookstores, bars, coffee shops, newspapers, health clinics, rape and abuse centers, daycares that kind of have a feminist bent to them. And, of course, after the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, abortion clinics and just general women's health clinics that focus on women, like Planned Parenthood. We also see the publication of Miss Magazine. The idea behind this Miss Magazine is that previously women were either Mrs. or Miss, and that was abbreviated in such a way that you could tell if a woman was married or not. And, of course, feminists would say, well, wait a minute, we're not property. That's not how this should work. And Miss Magazine was very successful. It's still around today. The woman here on the bottom left, I want to draw your the bottom right, excuse me. I want to draw your attention to. That's Gloria Steinem, and she was in some ways an ironic figure. She was an ardent feminist, and she was very articulate and bright, but she's also quite beautiful, as you can see. And so a lot of times the mainstream news, the guys down in the mainstream newsroom would say, we need to talk to a feminist, get the hot one. And so she became, in many ways, the face of feminism, but ironically it was because all the guys thought she was attractive, and of course she was going on TV and arguing women shouldn't be valued only for their beauty. And so it put her in this sort of ironic position, but it also highlighted exactly what the feminists were talking about. In 1971, affirmative action was expanded to cover women. You had to show that you were giving women a reasonable chance to get jobs in your business as well. Universities also began to go co-ed. Believe it or not, many universities across the country were all male, and then they would have all female counterparts. And it's not really until the late 1960s, early 1970s that it becomes the standard that men and women go to college together. Princeton and Yale don't go co-ed until 1969. In 1972, a piece of legislation called Title IX will say that colleges and universities have to spend the same amount of dollars on scholarships for female athletes as they do male athletes, which is why there is such a robust female athletics program in college today. And of course, the problem here is football. And I don't say football is the problem lightly. But because there is no female counterpart to football, what ends up happening is the 45 or 50 scholarships, or whatever it is, that your football team has, those have to be made up somewhere with female athletes. And so you have to have a lot more female sports to balance out the football scholarships. And so you might have, like here in Austin at the University of Texas, women's soccer is a scholarship sport, but men's soccer is not, in order to balance this out. By the mid-1970s, half of married women have jobs. 90% of college-educated women work. 2 careers becomes the norm for a middle-class family with the man and the woman working. Keeping your last name, or hyphenating your name so it's still in there. The idea that I don't stop being me when I marry somebody else. Or being called Miss, like I talked about earlier, as opposed to Mrs., the idea that you're not being branded as being married to someone. By the mid-1980s, we have women in Congress. We have women on the Supreme Court. Ronald Reagan will put Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court, be the first woman on the Supreme Court. We have governors and women, and of course we don't have a woman president yet, but we have women in almost every other position. Sandra Day O'Connor is appointed in 1981 as the first woman on the court. The second woman is appointed by Bill Clinton in 1993, and that's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In 1984, the Democratic Party nominates the very first female vice presidential candidate for a major party ticket, in Geraldine Ferraro. Now, Ferraro and Mondale get crushed, but it is a breakthrough for women. They're on the ticket. And, of course, in 2008, John McCain will choose Sarah Palin, and the Republicans will have their first female vice presidential candidate. We actually have back-to-back secretaries of state. I guess they're not back-to-back, but they're close to each other, who are women, and Madeleine Albright in the Clinton administration and Condoleezza Rice in the Bush administration. Universities around the country develop women and gender studies programs and begin to study the history of women and how they've been treated and attitudes towards them. The Equal Rights Amendment is pushed through Congress in 1972. This thing had been around since the original women's rights movement back in the Progressive era, but it fails to gain support in enough states to pass, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But perhaps the highest profile issue dealing with women's rights is the abortion issue. The argument about reproductive rights goes all the way back to the 20s, or maybe a little before, with Margaret Sanger and her push for birth control. It originally is kind of an awareness of the prevalence of rape, incest, and abuse, and then it becomes a fight over contraception. Many kind of traditionally minded Americans are very upset at the idea of contraception, that they fear that if contraception becomes easy and readily available, women will become loose, let's say. And by 1970s, the fight is over whether or not a woman should be able to have an abortion. In the 1800s, incidentally, abortion was legal almost everywhere. The idea that abortion is illegal is a relatively modern concept. But in the early 20th century, really when we get into that fight between the rural, conservative, traditional, fundamentalist America and the urban, modern, secular America, that's when abortion first becomes an issue. As states outlaw abortions, what happens is abortions move into the back alleys. They don't stop. They just continue under very unsanitary conditions, maybe in a bathroom or a kitchen table, or like I said, in an alley somewhere. The women's movement pressures states to legalize abortion, and many states do. And in 1973, the Supreme Court issues the decision Roe v. Wade, a case that comes out of actually here in Austin, Texas, where I am. And it's a very complicated ruling that I'm not going to get into here. But essentially it says that a woman has a right to an unrestricted right to an abortion for the first 3 months. It's actually the Supreme Court case that invents trimesters. That's not a medical concept. That's actually a legal concept. It's based on an earlier case called Griswold v. Connecticut, a 1965 case, but somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, that said that states couldn't outlaw the pill, birth control in a pill form, because that was an invasion of our privacy. In fact, the whole idea of the right to privacy, which a phrase we use all the time, is really invented in Griswold v. Connecticut and is reinforced in Roe v. Wade. Of course, like so many things, all the energy before Roe v. Wade was on the pro-choice side, those who argued a woman had a right to get an abortion. But of course, as soon as the decision is handed down, all the energy immediately shifts to the pro-life side, those who argue that a woman should not be able to get an abortion. And we'll certainly be following that as we go through these last few chapters.